It was 2:30 a.m. in the middle of a raging storm when I received the call from Brandon. His voice was trembling, and in one desperate, panicked moment, he whispered, "I think something's in the ditch." Before I could ask any questions, the line went dead. That single call shattered the silence and set off a chain of events that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I was driving home through Bridgewater, Minnesota, when I heard about Brandon's predicament. The road was empty, the trees looming like silent sentinels, and the only sound was the relentless downpour mixed with the distant rumble of thunder. Every mile felt like a descent into darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, Brandon called his parents, but I was on the line too, listening in horror. His voice, usually so full of life, now sounded desperate and hollow. I could hear the static and the trembling as he described a presence lurking near his car. Then, abruptly, the call cut out. In that moment, my heart pounded like never before. Knew something inhuman had taken hold of the night. I couldn't ignore the pull of fear. I pulled over near where Brandon's car was last seen. As I stepped out into the rain, my eyes strained against the downpour. And then I saw it. A dark, shifting figure among the trees, moving slowly as if it were a part of the night itself. My skin crawled as I realized I wasn't alone. Something was watching, waiting. As I approached the car, the headlights flickered erratically. A cold wind swept over me, and in that moment, I heard a whisper, a sound that shouldn't have been human. It wasn't a shout, but a chilling murmur that seemed to come from the very darkness around me. I felt a paralyzing dread, as if the night itself had conspired to steal Brandon away. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but the signal vanished as if swallowed by the storm. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence, a sound that chilled me to the bone. In that agonizing moment, time seemed to freeze. I realized with horror that this was no ordinary disappearance. Something beyond our world had claimed Brandon. I stood frozen, paralyzed by terror, as the echo of that scream faded into the darkness. Even now, I struggled to escape the memory of that night. Brandon was never found, and I have been left with a void filled with unanswered questions and unspeakable horror. I know in my heart that the night claimed him in a way no one can explain, a supernatural theft of a soul. If you ever find yourself in a situation where the darkness seems to whisper and the night hides more than it reveals, remember, some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and sometimes the shadows take more than just a moment. They take a life. It was midnight when I was wandering the deserted lobby of the Grand Hotel, my footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Suddenly, a piercing scream, half man, half ghost, ripped through the silence. I froze. Had I really heard that? My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced around, the darkness swallowing every corner. That scream wasn't just a sound, it was an omen. I knew then something unspeakable haunted this place. I arrived at the Grand Hotel a week earlier, drawn by rumors of its dark past and strange occurrences. The building itself was a relic, a majestic, crumbling structure adorned with faded gold leaf and intricate carvings, yet exuding an unsettling presence. The air was thick with an inexplicable chill, and the corridors seemed to whisper secrets. Every creak and groan of the old wood made my skin crawl, as if the very walls held memories of pain and despair. That first night inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I made my way down a long, dim corridor, lined with antique portraits whose eyes seemed to follow me, I heard soft, shuffling footsteps behind me. I stopped, and in that frozen moment I caught a glimpse of a dark, shifting figure disappearing around the corner. My blood ran cold. Was it a trick of the light, or was the phantom truly stalking me? In a desperate search for answers, I found a hidden door behind a tattered tapestry. Beyond it lay a forgotten study, dust-laden and cold. On an old wooden desk, I discovered a leather-bound diary. Its pages, yellowed with age, detailed the tragic story of a young guest who had met a gruesome end, and spoke of a vengeful spirit doomed to roam the halls forever. The final entry sent shivers down my spine, describing a ritual gone horribly wrong and a curse that would claim the souls of all who dared enter. Barely had I closed the diary when a sudden, cold gust of wind slammed the door behind me. I heard it before I saw it, a low, guttural moan that vibrated through the walls. The phantom had made its presence known. I bolted down the hallway, heart hammering as spectral figures danced in the periphery of my vision. Every step felt like I was being pulled deeper into a nightmare. The hotel itself seemed to shift, the corridors elongating, as if determined to trap me within its cursed embrace. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, finally stumbling into a grand ballroom. But the ballroom was no place of celebration. It was frozen in time, draped in decaying opulence. The room was empty, yet every mirror and chandelier reflected not just my trembling form, but also twisted, nightmarish images that weren't my own. It was as if the hotel itself was alive, warping reality around me. I realized then that I was lost in a maze of shifting rooms, where nothing was as it seemed, and every door could lead to either salvation or doom. I finally reached the heart of the nightmare, a hidden chamber behind the ballroom where the air pulsed with malevolence. There, amidst broken relics and shattered dreams, I came face to face with the phantom. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a presence, a twisted amalgamation of grief and rage, with eyes that burned like embers. In that moment, I realized the true horror. The phantom was the tormented soul of the hotel's last guest, forever trapped by a curse that demanded blood and despair. The confrontation was overwhelming, a battle of wills where I felt my very soul being siphoned away. I barely escaped, running with every ounce of strength, knowing that what I had witnessed was beyond human comprehension. I managed to escape that cursed chamber, my body battered and my mind scarred. As I fled the hotel, the echoes of the phantom's anguished cries followed me out into the cold night. Even now, long after I left that place, I still feel its presence, a constant, oppressive weight on my soul. Every shadow reminds me of that night. Every whisper of wind carries the ghostly echo of its sorrow. I warn you, if you ever find yourself near the Grand Hotel, run, because once the phantom touches you, its curse lingers, leaving you haunted long after you think you're safe. Remember, sometimes the most terrifying stories are not those made up by our imaginations, but those that lurk in the forgotten corners of our world. Stay safe, and always keep your eyes open in the darkness. I'll never forget the night it all began. I was fast asleep when suddenly I was jolted awake by a piercing scream, an anguished, blood-curdling cry echoing from the walls of my old house. I sat up, heart pounding, convinced I was trapped in a nightmare. The scream was so raw, so real, that I could almost feel the terror seep into my bones. In that moment, I wondered, was it just my imagination, or was something truly horrifying trapped within these walls? Unable to shake the sound, I grabbed my flashlight and crept out of bed. The hallway was long and narrow, the carpet threadbare, the wallpaper peeling in patches. Each step I took echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. As I moved toward the source of the scream, I noticed that the wall itself seemed to tremble. I pressed my ear against it, and that's when I heard it again, a gut-wrenching cry mixed with desperate whispers. My mind raced. Who was trapped inside? What pain were they enduring? I began investigating further. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle in the silence made my skin crawl. I discovered strange marks along the baseboard, scratches that looked far too deliberate to be from rodents. In one room, I found an old family portrait with eyes that seemed to follow me. The sense of dread was growing, each new detail a piece of a puzzle I couldn't quite understand. I started to feel as if the house was watching me, as if it were alive and hiding unspeakable secrets within its very walls. Then I reached the room where the screaming was loudest. I pressed my trembling hand to the wall, and suddenly the whispering turned into a full-throated scream. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I heard a man crying out in pain, so raw, so desperate. I closed my eyes, imagining the anguish of a soul trapped behind those crumbling layers of plaster and wood. I knew then that I wasn't alone. Someone or something was imprisoned in my home. But I had no idea what awaited me if I dug any deeper. Over the next few nights, the screams became a twisted conversation. I began to hear snippets of words, a plea, a curse. Even my own name whispered back to me in a distorted, inhuman tone. One night, I recorded the sounds on my phone. Listening to the playback sent chills down my spine. It was as if the voice was trying to warn me, or perhaps to lure me deeper into the darkness of the house. I couldn't tell if it was the tormented cry of a trapped soul or a malevolent force toying with my mind. I couldn't resist any longer. One stormy night, I returned to that cursed room, determined to confront the source of the terror. As I shone my flashlight into a dark corner of the wall, I saw movement, a shadow shifting slowly. My breath caught as the silhouette resolved into a man's face, contorted in agony and fear, his eyes wide and wild. His mouth opened in a silent scream that echoed in my mind. I froze, paralyzed by horror, as the apparition seemed to reach out toward me with a desperate, pleading gesture. After that night, the house changed. The walls began to pulse as if they were breathing. Every night, I'd hear the constant, low moan of a man, sometimes rising to a scream, sometimes fading into a sorrowful wail. I tried to leave, but every time I stepped outside, the sound followed me, echoing from the very walls of the property. It was as if the house itself was cursed, its very structure infused with an unholy presence. I started to doubt my sanity. Was it real, or had the terror infected my mind? I reached my breaking point. One final night, I decided I had to know the truth. I returned to the room where I had seen the screaming man. With shaking hands, I pressed my ear against the wall once more. Instead of the agonized cries, I heard a whisper that chilled me to the core. "Help me, please." Suddenly, the wall shuddered violently, and the spectral figure burst forth in a cascade of tortured screams. In that moment, I saw it clearly. A man trapped in eternal torment, his face a mask of horror and despair. I backed away in terror as his ghostly hand brushed against my cheek, and I felt a searing pain, as if his suffering had seeped into my soul. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, my heart pounding, my mind screaming for escape. I didn't look back until I reached the safety of the road. Even then, the house loomed behind me, a silent, sinister sentinel. The screams continued to echo in my ears long after I had left its cursed grounds. I knew I could never return, that the horror I witnessed would haunt me forever. The memory of that tortured man, his endless cries for help, would never fade. Now I live with the nightmares. I still hear those screams in the quiet moments, when the wind whispers through my window, or when darkness falls. I warn anyone who dares to listen, do not ignore the signs. There are things in this world that should remain hidden, and some horrors should never be disturbed. My experience with the screaming man in the walls has left me scarred for life. Even as I try to rebuild my shattered sanity, I know that every creak of a floorboard and every whisper in the night might be the echo of that eternal, agonizing scream. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I swear I see his haunted face staring back at me. I still remember waking up in the dead of night, my heart pounding as I realized I was alone in the freezing dark. I was lying on a hard, cold surface, snow and ice pressed against my skin. I couldn't recall how I'd gotten here. All I knew was that something inexplicable had pulled us away from everything familiar, and now I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. I'm one of the Yuba County Five. That night, after a simple basketball game turned into a nightmare, I experienced terror beyond belief. I remember the warmth and laughter just hours before. My friends and I had attended a local basketball game in California, a night that started with excitement and camaraderie. We joked, we cheered, and we left the arena with high spirits. But as we piled into our car, none of us could have predicted that our lives were about to be forever altered. After the game, we set off on what we thought was an impromptu road trip. But then, without warning, our car sputtered and died on a deserted mountain road. In a haze of panic and confusion, we abandoned it, leaving behind the only semblance of safety we'd ever known. Something deep inside urged us to leave that metal cocoon. I remember the shiver that ran down my spine as we stepped out into the biting cold. We trudged into the wilderness, our breaths visible in the frigid air, each step taking us deeper into an unknown nightmare. The trees around us seemed to whisper secrets, and every shadow felt like it held a threat. With no clear path and an unyielding cold seeping into our bones, dread replaced our earlier laughter. I can still feel the crunch of snow beneath my boots and the relentless pressure of the wilderness closing in. As the hours turned into days, we stumbled upon abandoned shelters stocked with food. Yet, I can't shake the haunting memory. Despite the abundant provisions, I felt no hunger. My body ignored the food, as if some unseen force had taken my desire to eat. I watched in disbelief as my friends nibbled, while I remained numb and frozen in more ways than one. Then, the night came when I first felt it, a presence watching us from the darkness. As I huddled in a corner for warmth, I could almost see a shadow moving among the trees. I heard faint whispers, as if voices were carried on the wind, urging us deeper into the unknown. I couldn't tell if it was our own fear or something truly sinister, but I knew one thing: something was out there. Then came the moment that shattered any remnants of hope. In the dead silence of one brutal night, I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and then a blood-curdling scream that pierced the cold. I turned, heart pounding, only to catch a glimpse of something impossible. A figure that seemed to be made of darkness itself, moving with unnatural speed. My mind raced as I realized this was the force that had driven us from our car. We were being hunted, compelled by an unknown terror that made us leave everything behind. I ran, my every instinct screaming to survive, but that night, the wilderness became a labyrinth of nightmares. Days later, rescue teams found our car abandoned on that lonely road. They later discovered the bodies of my friends scattered in the mountains, each bearing the marks of a long, harrowing struggle against the elements. I was the sole survivor, found weak and shivering, having somehow endured weeks of freezing temperatures without ever consuming the food around me. The mystery of why we abandoned our car and trekked into that lethal wilderness still haunts me. I was left with more questions than answers. In the quiet moments that followed, as I sat alone on a rocky outcrop, I couldn't shake the question that tormented me. What drove us into the wilderness? Was it pure panic, or was something far more sinister at work? An unseen force, a curse, or a malevolent presence that compelled us to leave the safety of our car behind. The truth remains elusive, buried in the icy silence of those mountains, and I live every day haunted by its mystery. Now, as I stand here and recount these events, every whisper of wind and every shadow reminds me of that night. I can't help but wonder if the terror we experienced was a warning, a dark message from a force beyond our understanding. Even now, in the silence of the night, I feel its presence lingering at the edges of my vision. I share this story with you not to terrify you. Well, maybe just a little. but to remind us all that sometimes the scariest mysteries remain unsolved, and the unknown can reach out to us in the most unexpected ways. So, I ask you, when you drive down a lonely road or wander in the darkness, do you truly feel safe? Remember, the shadows hide more than just darkness. They hide our nightmares. Have you ever felt that something wasn't right in a place you thought was safe? I still shudder when I remember the day my world turned upside down in the deep, dark woods of Oregon. Imagine hiking through a sun-dappled forest, only to have your little one vanish into thin air, with nothing but a chilling, empty silence in his wake. I'm here to tell you about the day our 4-year-old disappeared, and what we discovered will haunt me forever. It was an ordinary day for my family. We set out on a hiking trail known only to locals, a hidden gem deep in Oregon's wilderness. The air was crisp, birds chirped softly, and my son's laughter filled the forest. I thought nothing could go wrong, but deep down, an unsettling feeling was beginning to brew. Then, without warning, everything changed. One moment, my son was right beside me, his hand gripping mine. The next, he was gone. I froze. Panic instantly gripped me as I spun around frantically. There was no trace of him. His bright laughter was replaced by an eerie silence that swallowed the forest whole. I must have run for what felt like hours, calling out his name, searching every nook and cranny of that vast, unforgiving wilderness. Fellow hikers and local search teams joined in our desperate quest. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant bark, sent shivers down my spine as hope and dread battled inside me. I must have run for what felt like hours, calling out his name, searching every nook and cranny of that vast, unforgiving wilderness. Fellow hikers and local search teams joined in our desperate quest. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant bark sent shivers down my spine as hope and dread battled inside me. Just as our hope began to wane, a search dog started barking furiously, tugging at its leash and leading us deeper into a part of the woods that we'd passed before. We followed the dog into a dense, overgrown section where the sunlight barely touched the forest floor. My heart pounded louder with every step. There, in a small clearing surrounded by gnarled trees, we finally found him. My 4-year-old son stood motionless, eyes wide and blank, staring up at a massive, ancient tree. His small frame shivered in the eerie silence. I rushed to him, my voice trembling as I asked where he had been. When I knelt beside him, desperate for an answer, he simply pointed upward. In a small, monotone voice, he said, "The other boy took me up there." My heart sank. I looked up. There was no one. No other child, no friendly face, just the tree, standing silent and sinister as if guarding a terrible secret. The search teams had scoured these woods multiple times before, and yet he had never been here, until now. How could he have been taken here, led by another child that no one else had seen? My mind raced with terror and confusion. That night, local residents came forward with a grim tale. Decades ago, a little boy had gone missing in these very woods, never to be found again. It seemed that the forest held a secret, a dark legacy that had now intertwined with our lives. I couldn't shake the feeling that something otherworldly was at play, a malevolent force that had reached out across time to claim the lost souls of this forest. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant whisper in the wind, now felt like a message from the past. I began to question my own sanity. Was it really possible that the spirit of that missing boy was still roaming these woods, or that something far more sinister was guiding my son? I still don't know what happened that day. Every time I close my eyes, I see my son standing silently by that ancient tree, his eyes void of life, and I hear his whisper, "The other boy took me up there." I'm left wondering if our encounter was a twisted echo of the past, a ghostly repetition of a tragedy that refused to die. As I share this with you, I can only hope that you never find yourself lost in a forest where the past comes hauntingly alive. Remember, sometimes the darkest secrets lie in the most forgotten places, waiting for the right moment to reach out and take you too. Have you ever seen your own reflection, only to realize it wasn't really you? Last night, while working the night shift at an old hospital, I experienced something that chilled me to the bone. A doppelganger that appeared right before death. I'm about to share the true story of that night, and trust me, you won't sleep well tonight. I remember the night clearly. I was finishing up my rounds in the hospital, a place that has always had an eerie feel with its flickering lights and cold, echoing corridors. I was alone, immersed in the routine, until something caught my eye that I could never forget. As I passed by one of the long, dim hallways, I saw a figure, a woman in outdated clothes, slowly walking toward the exit. My heart skipped a beat. I called out, "Ma'am, visiting hours are over." But she didn't even slow down. There was something otherworldly about her calm, unhurried pace. I hurried after her, my footsteps echoing in the sterile corridor. My mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why was she wandering here at this hour? I pushed myself harder, desperate to catch up to her, but when I finally reached the hallway, she had vanished into thin air. Shaken, I rushed to the security office and pleaded with the guard to check the cameras. When we reviewed the footage, my blood ran cold. There she was. A spectral figure walking steadily toward the exit, and then, just as she reached the door, she simply disappeared. The image was grainy, but it was undeniable. The following morning, still reeling from last night's events, I went about my day with a lingering dread. At admission, I froze. A new patient was being checked in, a woman who looked exactly like the figure from last night. I couldn't believe my eyes. I mentioned what I'd seen to one of the older nurses during my break. With a grave expression, she leaned in and said, "That happens sometimes. People see themselves here before they die." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew deep down that this wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something far more sinister. That same evening, the mysterious patient passed away. I was left haunted by the encounter. I spent hours reviewing my memories, questioning if what I saw was a ghost, a premonition, or a mirror of one's fate. The hospital, already steeped in dark history, had revealed another secret, a warning of our inevitable end. Now, as I record this, I'm still haunted by that inexplicable moment. Every time I walk these halls, I feel as though I might catch another glimpse of my own doppelganger. It's a constant reminder that sometimes the scariest thing isn't an external monster. It's the reflection of your own mortality staring back at you. I leave you with this unsettling thought. In a place as old and forgotten as this hospital, maybe what we see isn't always a ghost, but a glimpse of our own final hour. Be careful where you look in the dark. Sometimes you might just see your own face, and that might be the last thing you ever see. I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering that day in the Green Mountains of Vermont. Imagine trekking deep into the woods when suddenly something caught my eye, a decrepit house, hidden by nature itself. I never believed in ghost stories until that moment. I ask you, have you ever seen something that defies all logic? Because what I'm about to share will change everything you thought you knew about the supernatural. It was early autumn, the air crisp and the forest alive with whispering winds. I had been hiking alone for hours, my boots crunching on fallen leaves. Then off the beaten trail, I noticed a strange clearing that I'd never seen before. My heart pounded as I moved closer, compelled by a mix of curiosity and an inexplicable dread. As I stepped into the clearing, there it was, an old, crumbling house that looked like it had been forgotten by time. Its wooden siding was weathered, and the windows were dark, as if hiding secrets too terrible to share. I couldn't believe my eyes. This was no ordinary abandoned building. Against every instinct, I crept closer and peered through a broken window. Inside, the air was thick with dust. I saw faded, dusty furniture scattered about, a worn armchair, a creaky wooden table, and on a wall, an old family portrait from the 1940s stared back at me with eyes that seemed to follow my every move. Old newspapers lay strewn across the floor, their headlines now ghostly echoes of a bygone era. Something about that portrait made my skin crawl. I felt as if the house was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. My pulse raced as I slowly backed away, leaving the house and its ghostly occupants behind. The atmosphere was thick with dread, and every creak of the wood seemed to whisper warnings. I left as quickly as my trembling legs would allow, my mind racing with questions about what I had just witnessed. The next morning, driven by a desperate need for answers, I returned with a close friend. We retraced my steps, hearts pounding in unison, expecting to confront the mysterious structure again. But when we reached the clearing, nothing. No house, no foundation, not even a whisper of debris. It was as if the house had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the lingering chill of its presence. I soon learned from the locals that I wasn't alone in this encounter. Stories of ghost houses, houses that appear and vanish without a trace, are passed down through hushed whispers. The elders spoke of a curse, a tragic history intertwined with the land, and warned that some things are best left unseen. The more I heard, the deeper I fell into a pit of terror and uncertainty. That night, I couldn't shake the image of that eerie family portrait and the empty, haunted space. I lay awake, haunted by the memory and tormented by the question. Was it all in my mind, or had I truly stumbled upon a portal to another realm? Every shadow seemed to twist and contort, every sound a warning. I realized then that the vanishing house was not just a building. It was a doorway to the past, a cursed memory that refused to fade. In the days that followed, I began receiving cryptic messages. Anonymous notes slipped under my door that simply read, "Don't look back." My friend and I grew paranoid, constantly checking over our shoulders. One night, as I reviewed old photos of the clearing on my phone, I noticed something chilling in the background of one image. A faint outline of the house, standing solid, even though we had seen nothing the day before. Had the house truly vanished, or was it waiting for me to return? I felt a cold dread wash over me. I realized that the curse might not be confined to the past. It was alive, and it was watching. I never found a rational explanation for the vanishing house in Vermont. Was it a relic of a forgotten tragedy? A cursed structure caught between dimensions? Or perhaps my own mind playing cruel tricks on me? One thing is certain. I will never forget that encounter. Even now, every time I hike in the Green Mountains, I feel as though I'm being watched by unseen eyes, waiting for the next chapter of that unspeakable story to unfold. And as I close this video, I urge you, be careful what you seek in the shadows. Sometimes the past is better left undisturbed. Remember, there are places in this world where reality frays at the edges, where time and memory vanish into the mist. And if you ever stumble upon a ghost house, run. I still remember the moment like it was yesterday, like a glitch in time. I was driving alone on a desolate Texas highway, the kind of road where the darkness seems to swallow you whole. Suddenly, I found myself questioning, have you ever lost hours of your life only to wake up and find that time itself has betrayed you? It was 2:47 a.m. when I pulled over at a quiet rest stop. I was exhausted, my eyelids heavy from endless hours on the road, and decided a short nap would do me good. Before I closed my eyes, I glanced at my phone. The screen read 2:47 a.m., the time etched in neon blue. I never imagined that glance would haunt me forever. I remember the moment I drifted off. The hum of the engine and the soft rustle of the wind outside mingled into a lullaby that was almost too gentle. But as I sank into sleep, there was a strange unease, a feeling that I wasn't entirely alone in that moment. I closed my eyes and the darkness swallowed me whole. I woke with a start. My head throbbed and my heart pounded as I fumbled for my phone. I expected to see a different time, maybe even a different date. But there it was, 2:47 a.m., unchanged. Confused, I looked outside. The darkness had vanished. Broad daylight filled the sky. My car, once parked neatly, was now in a slightly different position. My gas gauge read nearly empty. I had no memory of what had transpired during those missing hours. I sat there stunned. Just moments before, my tank was half full. Now it was nearly empty. How could that be? Every instinct in me screamed that something was terribly wrong. I stepped out and examined the car, the tires, the position. Everything felt off. It was as if time had warped around me, stealing away not just minutes but memories. I tried to piece it together. I remembered driving, then pulling over. But the hours between 2:47 a.m. and daylight were a void, a gap in my mind. I couldn't recall a single moment. It was like someone had erased those hours. My thoughts swirled with fear and confusion. Was it a dream, a hallucination, or something far more sinister? As I sat in my car, trying to comprehend the inexplicable, I felt it, the presence of something or someone hovering just at the edge of my perception. There were faint whispers, as if carried on the wind, and a cold chill that made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that during those missing hours I wasn't alone. Then, in a moment that froze my blood, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, a dark, indistinct shape, lingered just outside the car. I turned quickly, heart hammering, but there was nothing there, only the endless, empty expanse of the rest stop. Yet I knew, deep down, that I had not been alone. The presence was real. Panicked, I dialed 911. My voice trembled as I recounted every detail, the time, the shifting car, the empty tank, and the horrifying feeling of an unseen presence. The operator's calm voice only deepened my unease. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone, as if the night itself had conspired to rob me of time and sanity. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. The missing hours remain an unsolved nightmare. A gap in time that stole away a part of me. I warn you, sometimes the most horrifying mysteries are not what you see, but what is missing. Remember, when you drift off, check the time before you close your eyes, because you never know what or who might be waiting in the darkness to steal your time. I still wake up in cold sweats remembering that night. It began with the sound of crunching leaves right outside my tent. I had no idea that what I was about to witness would haunt me forever. Imagine being alone in the Appalachian darkness when someone stares back at you with a twisted, unblinking grin. What if that smile never fades? I had chosen this remote spot for its solitude, a perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. The night was calm, the only sounds being the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees and my own steady breathing. Little did I know that the tranquility would soon shatter into a nightmare. It was around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake by a relentless, rhythmic crunching. At first I thought it was just a branch snapping under the weight of a deer, but the sound was too deliberate, too measured. It was as if every step was calculated to get closer to me. Trembling, I unzipped my tent flap just enough to peer into the inky darkness. There, at the very edge of the tree line, stood a tall man. His eyes locked onto mine, and his face twisted into an unnatural, chilling smile that never wavered. I couldn't blink. I couldn't move. I froze. My heart pounded in my ears, and every muscle in my body locked in terror. Clutching the cold metal of my knife, I dared not breathe or move. All I could do was stare back at that smiling face, praying it wouldn't step any closer. Minutes, or what felt like an eternity, passed in that suspended moment. Then, as if it had been watching me all along, the figure slowly stepped backward into the darkness. Not a single blink, not a single step too many, until he vanished completely. At dawn, I awoke with a start, my entire body drenched in sweat. I stepped out to the crisp morning air, and my blood ran cold. Footprints, dozens of them, meticulously circling my tent, over and over. They were too deep, too deliberate. They whispered that I wasn't alone, not last night, not ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked, watched, or perhaps even chosen. Every rustle in the wind and every creak of a branch now sent shivers down my spine. I was haunted not just by the memory of that unblinking smile, but by the idea that someone or something might still be out there, waiting in the darkness. In the days that followed, I couldn't help but retrace every step of that night. I examined the footprints, and to my horror, I discovered something even more disturbing. A small, torn scrap of cloth caught on a branch near my tent, bearing a symbol I'd never seen before. Was it a warning? A signature? My mind raced with questions that had no answers. Even now, I lie awake at night, haunted by that twisted, unblinking smile and the echo of crunching leaves. I warn you, if you ever find yourself alone in the dark woods, listen for the sound of leaves underfoot and be prepared. Because once you see the smiling man, your nights will never be the same. And remember, the forest always watches, waiting for its next visitor. It was 3:17 a.m. on a stormy night, and as I patrolled the dim corridors of St. Helena Hospital, a call light began flashing repeatedly from room 315. My heart pounded as I thought, room 315, but that room has been empty for weeks. What could be wrong? I worked the night shift in the hospital, a job I once found comforting in its routine and sterile calm. But that night, something was terribly off. As I made my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sound of that incessant call light haunted my every step, as if pleading for help. Room 315. I approached slowly, my heart thumping in my ears. I recalled the staff meetings and old memos that mentioned the room had been out of use ever since a patient died there months ago. Yet there it was, a persistent, glowing call light that refused to be silenced. I hesitated for a split second before I pushed open the door. Inside, the room was shrouded in an eerie stillness. The bed was made neatly, and the only sound was the soft humming of a broken air conditioner. Then I saw her, an elderly woman in a faded white hospital gown. She sat motionless on the bed, her eyes fixed on a distant, blank wall. I froze, unable to move as her eyes bore into mine. The silence was suffocating. I stepped closer, my voice trembling as I cleared my throat. And then it happened. A barely audible whisper, as if carried by the wind, slipped through the silence. "Tell them I'm still here." I couldn't believe my ears. The words were soft, yet they echoed with a despair that chilled me to the bone. Panic surged through me. I screamed, a sound that I'm sure echoed down every corridor, and I bolted out of the room. My hands trembled so badly that I nearly dropped my flashlight. I could still hear that whisper, reverberating in my mind. Outside, I found myself gasping for breath. I needed answers, and I ran to find help. In the break room, my hands still shaking, I confided in an older colleague, a veteran nurse with more than a few years of experience in this very hospital. Her eyes widened as I described what I had seen in room 315. She leaned in close and whispered, "That patient, she died in that room months ago. Her body was left unattended for hours before anyone found her." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I was standing face to face with the ghost of a forgotten patient. I couldn't shake the image of that woman from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her hollow gaze and heard that desperate plea. That night, sleep eluded me as the unanswered questions swirled in my thoughts. Who was she? Why was her spirit still lingering here? And what did she want me to tell them? I found myself wandering the empty halls, haunted by the feeling of being followed. Determined to find the truth, I returned to room 315 the following night, despite every instinct telling me to stay away. The door creaked open with an agonizing groan, and there she was again, the ghostly patient, sitting there as if waiting. "Tell them I'm still here." Her voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken sorrows. In that moment, terror and pity mingled within me. I could do nothing but stare, frozen in a blend of fear and sorrow. I never forgot that night. Even now, when I pass by room 315, I feel a shiver crawling down my spine. I still wonder, was it truly her spirit that lingered, reaching out for someone to remember her? Or was it a manifestation of the sorrow and neglect that plagued that room? I left the hospital that night with more questions than answers, and a promise to myself never to return. But every time the call light flashes in my dreams, I hear her haunting whisper, "Tell them I'm still here." And I know that in that forgotten room, a ghost patient still waits, trapped between life and death, desperate to be remembered. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, please like, subscribe, and share.